This lecture is about developmental psychology. Developmental psychology is essentially the study of change, or lack therefore of, across time. So what we're looking to see is how people are different at different ages. There are three major areas where phenomenon can fall within developmental psychology. There's physical development, cognitive development, which includes thinking, and social development. So I'm going to say a few things about each. First, in physical development. One of the most notable things within physical development is brain development. The deal with the brain is that we have more neurons when we're born than we will ever have for the rest of our lives. Essentially, once we're born, it's just a matter of decreasing neurons from there on out. So you might be wondering why it is that babies aren't brilliant, because they have way more neurons than you have as an adult. And the reason for that is because, remember, intelligence or ability to think is not about how many neurons we have, but how many connections, how many synapses have been made between those neurons. So at birth, there are a lot of neurons, but very few synapses. And slowly across time, as a baby experiences the world and learns things, they make more and more connections, and that's how we develop abilities to use our brain. This picture just shows the few connections at birth, a few more by 3 months, and quite a few by 15 months. The senses develop differently. Actually, when a baby is born, their sense of hearing, for example, is pretty much what it would be for an adult. But our vision does develop, because when we're born, we don't see very well. In fact, when we're born, we basically just see light-dark contrast. Babies can see color, but they can't see edges or lines or details. And the reason for this is not because their eyes don't work. Their eyes work just fine, but it has to do with the brain. If you think about the environment in the uterus, you don't see anything. And so despite the fact that a baby's eyes work, actually midway through pregnancy, they can't take any information in because it's dark, and so the brain doesn't make any new connections in the occipital lobe where the visual stimulation goes. That's different than hearing, because the ears also start working partway through pregnancy, but they actually do hear what's going on in the environment around them in a very muffled kind of way. But they still get experience with sound, and so there are areas in their brain and the temporal lobes that are in charge of hearing and things like that get experience and start making connections. So this is one of the things that babies have to do when they come out of the womb, is learn about visual stimulation. Lastly, for physical development, I want to say something briefly about motor movements. We all know, of course, that babies should roll over, and then they should crawl, and then they should walk, and then they should run. And this is actually a really important sequence of events. There are some babies out there who seem to want to skip the crawling. They want to go directly to walking. And this is actually a red flag for development, that if this happens to you or someone that you know, you want to seek out some assistance, because it's really important for babies to crawl. There's something about the stimulation that they bring in through their hands, in particular by crawling. You have your hands on the floor, that's associated with parts of the brain that will later help that child read. So some children who didn't crawl have challenges learning how to read. So it is one of the things where you maybe need to go to a physical or an occupational therapist with a baby who's not crawling to try and get them that stimulation so that they avoid problems down the road. Okay, now on to cognitive development, which is how we think. And the major name in this realm is a guy named Jean Piaget. And Piaget had a very revolutionary idea. Children are different thinkers than adults. During his time, people thought that children were basically miniature adults that had the same skills, just not to the same extent. And Piaget said, no, that's actually not true. Babies and children have different skills than adults do. So he built up this theory of cognitive development, which is what CD stands for here, and his theory is based on the idea of schema building. And a schema, sometimes referred to as a script, is simply our scripts for what we know about how the world works. So for example, you have a classroom schema. When you go into a classroom, you know the general idea of what's supposed to happen. You'll sit down and take notes, the teacher in the front will talk. We have to learn these through experience, and so Piaget says that cognitive development is all about building up these schemas. So imagine that we're talking about the schema of what a bird is. So we have a 2-year-old who knows what a bird is, and it's essentially something with feathers and a beak, and it flies. But they haven't seen every single bird possible yet in life. They're actually getting exposed to new stimuli every day. So let's say that this child comes across a hummingbird. And a hummingbird is very different than a typical bird because it moves so quickly and so strangely. So what a child has to do is say, does this new creature fit into the bird category that I have? Does it have feathers? Yes. Does it have a beak? Yes. Does it fly? Yes. So all of that seems to indicate that this is in the same category. And what that child has done is actually just assimilated the bird, the hummingbird, into their bird schema. They've taken some new information and made it fit into an existing schema. That's a process called assimilation. Now let's say that same child comes across a bat for the first time, and it wants to know, does this bat fit into the bird category? There's some similarities here. Does it have feathers? Well, no. Does it have a beak? Not really. Does it fly? Yes, but it kind of flies in a different time of the day, and it flies strangely. So a child would probably come to the conclusion that no, this does not fit into that category, and in fact, the child needs to make a new category. And this is a process called accommodation. When something new doesn't fit into an existing category, a person will create a new schema. So this is the underlying idea behind Piaget's theory. He says that there's 4 stages in this theory. The sensory motor stage is from birth to approximately 2 years of age. And here, babies are using their sensory and their motor skills to learn about the environment, which is why it's called the sensory motor stage. And they gain a skill here called object permanence, that at some point between birth and 2 years, a baby can know that something exists, even though it's no longer in its vision. Early on, right after birth, that's not true. It's literally out of sight, out of mind for a newborn. If they can't see it, they can't know that it exists because they don't have the ability to hold a mental representation yet. So this baby in this picture has seen a toy, and then a researcher probably covered it up with a towel. And this baby is looking for the toy, which indicates that they know it still exists, even though they can't see it. And that indicates that the baby has object permanence. Then we move to the pre-operational stage, which Piaget says is approximately 2 to 7. And here, children lose something called egocentrism, and this is an idea that they can only think about the world through their own experiences. It's not that they're jerks. Lots of times we call people egocentric who think that they're the greatest thing on the planet. It's that literally, cognitively, they can't think past themselves. So a child who is egocentric will think that if they're sad, you're also sad. Or if their favorite food is ice cream, your favorite food must be ice cream too. So at some point between 2 to 7, they lose that. During this stage, they also lack something called conservation ability, and conservation has to do with the ability to understand that things can change physical shape and form and still maintain the sameness. So in this picture on the left, a researcher is showing 2 flasks to a child that are filled with the same amount of water, and she'll ask the child which one has more water, this one in my left hand, this one in my right hand, or are they the same? And children will say they're the same. They can see that the 2 levels are equal. And what she does in the right-hand picture is she turns one of those upside down, and because the flask is shaped funny, the level of the water will go up. And she does this right in front of the child. There's no trickery involved. And then she'll ask the same child, now is it the one in my left hand who has more water, the one in my right, or are they the same? And during this stage, children who lack conservation will say that the one on the left, where the level has gone up higher, has more water. Even though they didn't see any more water being added, it looks higher to them now. Once they gain conservation ability, they'll have the understanding that just because the shape and the form has changed, that no quantity has been added and that they are the same. The next stage, the third stage, is the concrete operational stage, which is from 7 to 12 years. And here children do gain conservation, so when that water gets turned upside down, they'll know that it's still the same amount of water. And they also start to work on concrete logic, so things like math become a little bit more easy. But it's concrete, meaning that they are only able to think about things that are able to be touched or seen by them. So remember, when you learned how to do addition, your teacher probably asked you, if you had 2 apples and you added 1 apple, how many apples do you have? The reason that they said that and not, if you had 2 justices and added 1 justice, how many would you have, is that apples are something a child has concrete experience with, whereas justice is a very abstract idea. And then finally we have the formal operational stage, which we're supposed to get to by about 12 years, and this is where we can think abstractly. And then the third is social development. My favorite guy in social development is Erikson. And Erikson says that there are a handful of stages of psychosocial development through the lifespan, and that each stage is defined by a crisis or a battle. So there's an internal crisis or an internal battle going on in our psyche that is something we have to deal with at each stage. And that our experiences with other people and with the environment are what actually dictate which of the sides of the battle win. First, in infancy, we have a battle between trust and mistrust, based on, in this case, how our caregivers treat us. He says that if a baby cries and the caregiver reacts to them and takes care of them immediately, they'll learn that when I ask for help, I get it, and I can trust people. Whereas babies who cry or ask for help who don't get it because mom and dad are busy or they are letting a child try to cry it out, that child's going to develop mistrust. So developmentalists say that a baby should be responded to immediately every single time they cry within the first year, because they can't understand why you might not be coming to help them. They just understand that they've asked for help and not gotten it. Then in toddlerhood, children will battle between autonomy and shame and doubt. Autonomy is when we want to start doing things for ourselves. If you have small children, you know that at some point they start saying things like, let me hold the baby, let me pick out my clothes. Let's say you have a 3-year-old and it's breakfast time and your 3-year-old wants to pour the orange juice. You know in your head this is a disaster waiting to happen. There's going to be orange juice everywhere. But you have a couple choices. You can either say, okay, and get the paper towels ready and let the child try it, or maybe help and say, let's do it together. Either of those situations are allowing the child the ability to try the skills out. What they interpret that as is that I trust you and I think that you can and I'm here to support you. And for parents who let their kids try things, they develop autonomy. For parents who say, no, let me do it, you can't, or you're going to spill, and don't let their children try things out, are hearing, I don't trust you, I'm not here to support you, I need to do everything for you because you're not competent. And that develops into shame or doubt. And this is the beginning of self-esteem, really. People who develop autonomy are more likely to have a positive self-esteem, whereas shame and doubt is more related to negative self-esteem. Preschoolers develop an extension of this where instead of just saying, let me pour the juice or let me dress myself, they actually want to start planning events, and that's called initiative. Let me coordinate my playing. Let me start games. And if parents support those and let them try things out, then they're going to develop initiative. And if parents say, no, you can't, or we need to do something different, they start to develop guilt because they want something that the parent doesn't want, and that makes them feel badly. Then in elementary school, you get to try a lot of new things, right? You start going to lots of different classes, PE, music, math, science, reading, and you get exposed to lots of new skills. And children sometimes have a battle between, am I good enough for this? And if they feel like they're good enough to try, at least, then that's competence. If they become withdrawn, disinterested, or not willing to fail at something, that can develop a feeling of inferiority. Then we get to adolescence, where we are battling between finding out who we are or knowing our identity or having role confusion. And teenagers frequently will try on different identities through friends, through clothes, through music, through groups that they're part of. Those are all ways to figure out, who am I? And hopefully by the end of adolescence, someone will have tried enough things and come to a place where they know themselves well. During young adulthood, we're battling between intimacy or isolation. And intimacy, what we're talking about here, is emotional intimacy, not necessarily just physical intimacy. So this is closeness. So for young adults, a lot of times this works out as looking for a romantic partner, but it can also be looking for small groups of friends that are very important, or family connections. And if you don't find those connections, and if you don't feel like you belong anywhere, that there's nobody who loves you, then you experience isolation. And from a psychological perspective, isolation can be one of the most damaging things for our well-being. Then you get to middle adulthood, and this is where we hit what is called, in our common vernacular, the midlife crisis. Erikson says it's generativity versus stagnation. So generativity is where you feel like you're still moving forward, where you have new challenges, where your goals are important to you, and stagnation is where you're in a rut. So a lot of times in middle adulthood, you've been married to the same person for a while, and you've had the same kids for a while, and you've lived in the same house for a while, and you've had the same job for a while, and it all starts to feel pretty stagnant. And that's not good for us. We don't enjoy life when we feel stagnant or when we're in a rut. This is what happens to lots and lots of middle adult aged people. And the goal is to try and regain generativity when we have a midlife crisis. And of course there's healthy ways and not healthy ways of doing that. Some not healthy ways are doing things like having an affair or paying a lot of money for a car. Some healthy ways would be things like picking up a new hobby or coming back to school. And then finally, in late adulthood, we face integrity or despair. So at some point in life, we stop looking forward to see what's next, and we turn around and look back and see what has happened across our lives. People who can look back and feel proud of how they spent their life, who don't have many regrets, who feel like they did good work and that there was purpose, will feel integrity. Whereas people who look back and do have regrets, maybe they don't have close relationships with the children, or they spent a significant amount of their time doing something that they no longer value, that can lead to despair. So those are the three major areas of development. The book talks about a handful of different concepts within each, but I just wanted to point out some of the ones that I think are most interesting.